It's another Manly Monday, and this Manly Monday, we're talking about something that was actually a comment last week, and I didn't have time to get to it. Didn't have time to get to it in Feedback Friday. The idea that men like casual sex more than women. And this is one of these things that drives me absolutely crazy in gender stuff, because it's based on a lot of stuff that we just can't say. This idea that, men are more visually stimulated, men are more physically needy or whatever, more sexual needs. We've not found any of that to be true. And when people start rambling on about mate selection and children, and this assumes that all men and all women have sex out of a desire to have children, and that's just not so, right? Like, that alone we can say no. Does the fact that a woman can get pregnant curb some of the behavior that she otherwise would do? Yes. But I was also just talking to someone who works with youth yesterday, and she was saying that, STI transmissions rates, especially HIV transmission rates, have started to rise again because of the whole undetectable PrEP, that kind of stuff. The idea that it's a curable disease is causing people to behave more recklessly. And this gets us into the statistics on casual sex and what the people who research this stuff have said. Interesting stuff, nuance. There is some conjecture here, but I'll try to minimize that. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it, coffee.com/Leanna K. Now, I am going to link to a Psychology Today article that, provides links and stuff like this for this stuff, so that you can see it. This is somebody who researches this kind of thing. And TLDR, what this team found is that similar numbers of men and women have casual sexual encounters, at least one in their lifetime. Men tend to report something like double the number of casual encounters that women do. But the author of the article pointed out men tend to lie up about this stuff, and I will add women tend to lie down. Why? Because of gendered preconceptions about how much sex an ideal man and an ideal woman should have. I have at least one conversation a week with a man who's concerned about his lack of sexual experience. And I tell every single one of them that, women who are wise in that department go, oh, good, fewer things to unlearn. Because every person is different. Every person's body is different. Every person's motivations is different. There is not something special and unique about men that make them want to go out and screw absolutely every woman that they see is good enough for them. Whereas women, the suggestion is there's something wrong with a woman who wants to go out and have casual sex. And it's interesting because I do disagree with one thing this article says, and I think they may have been joking, but, the assertion that because to have heterosexual sex, a man needs a woman, the numbers should be about equal in terms of casual sex. And that's not what's going on. Another possibility is that, one woman is sleeping with all these different men, and it's like, okay, but that would skew the number of sexual encounters. And then we go back to, okay, this is all self-reported. We can't really trust. We have to take with a grain of salt all the reporting. Reasonable assumption is the true number of casual sexual experience that men have had is probably lower than reported, and the number of casual sexual experiences that women have is probably higher than reported because of social stigma and because of gendered expectations. And those gendered expectations are, I believe, the real reason. On top of that, and just these encounters tend to be younger people, and birth control is a thing. And, women may think twice. Women often think twice about even being put in that situation because of the fear of sexual assault. And that's the other thing that this study doesn't really get into. Well, it sort of does. It sort of does, because the reasons for the casual sex, the motivations, it's pretty grim. So the numbers are, most of the sample of the survey they conducted said they had casual sex ever. 73%. Not surprisingly, huge gender difference. Men reporting nearly twice as many hookups on average, 28, as women, 15. Okay, yeah. Given previous literature, this was expected, but still nonsensical. I'm reading from the audience. A handful of respondents even said they'd had more than 1,000 hookups, including one woman. Also, 8% of men, but only 3% of women said they had more than 100. The more interesting gender differences were in terms of what motivated individuals to engage in casual sex and how they felt afterwards. In terms of why men and women sought hookups, there was a fairly big gender difference overall, with predictable gender difference on items you would probably expect, such as I had a hookup because I was feeling miserable and because I was pressured. Because I was pressured, more agreement from women. Because I was feeling miserable, more agreement from women. For sexual gratification, satisfaction, more agreement from men. No gender differences for because I was seeking affection from another person and personal enjoyment, fun, and to increase my self-confidence. So men are doing it for ego. Women are doing it because they hate themselves and were pressured into it. Yikes. And that says something about the mindset of the men that those women were with, that they couldn't tell something was amiss here. We got to teach more on consent with everybody. But, and this is to protect men. We teach consent for men because we don't want men to get accused of sexual assault because of a misunderstanding. And that's why it's very, very important to teach this, in advance. Teach what consent means. Now, then they got into the emotional outcomes, whether they enjoyed it, whether they felt it was good. Compared to men, women said they felt more lonely, unhappy, rejected, regretful, felt more negative feelings about themselves, and were more concerned about being negatively judged by others. Men, on the other hand, said they felt more sexually satisfied, happier, confident, content, and their mood improved. Well, this makes sense because men's egos are, it's like, go out and have sex. You're a real man if you've slept with all these women. Whereas it's the opposite stereotype for women. I notice in A Court of Thorn and Roses, they have Farah, the female lead, having been with precisely one other man ever, to indicate that she knows how much better in bed Rhysand is, but one. That says a lot, and then the books also associate more female promiscuity with women who had been assaulted or badly treated by men. The nice thing about reading fiction like this that is supposed to be kind of guilty pleasure books is you see the societal kind of norms, the assumptions, the societal assumptions that go into building this stuff. You see a lot about a culture by its purely entertainment, not intended to be genius fiction. And I got that from a lecture on anime and manga that I attended at the Japanese Cultural Center years ago. So it makes sense that if women try casual sexual encounters and they feel worse afterwards, then they're not going to do it again, or certainly as often. And if men feel better after these casual sexual encounters, then they're going to do it more often, right? Women do it less because feels bad man. Men do it more because feels good man. But again, the article does bring up an interesting point. Where are these other sexual encounters coming from if women who have casual sex also report fewer partners than men? There's a problem with the numbers here, right? And the obvious thing to say is that, well, these guys are probably lying. And what does that say about culture? Few more things. Negative outcomes to casual sex, negative emotional outcomes, can be predicted if you're trying to regulate negative emotions or achieve positive emotions through sex. A plain English way of saying this is if you're feeling actively shitty and you think having sex with somebody you don't know terribly well is going to make you feel better, it probably isn't. You're probably going to feel worse. Most interesting thing about this article is that they couldn't find anything that could predict a positive outcome. No motivation was correlated with increased likelihood of positive outcome, which is really, really interesting to me. And, you know, in the work I do with men, most of my clients are men. I do find I don't know of many of them that prefer casual hookups. They'll be like, I've done them. They're not bragging about them. And granted, this is my client base, right? But they're not bragging about them. They'll just say, I've done them. They're not my favorite thing. I want a serious relationship. And I do think that if we made that the center of the conversation, instead of this, men only want sex, men are after one thing, sex, 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 all men want is sex, and this is something women believe about men, this is something men also believe about other men, and hence the lying. And then, you know, there's the whole fear of being seen as a slut in women. And as much as we talk about not slut shaming, I see firsthand the number of other women who think it's an insult to me to say I was a prostitute or a sex worker or some sort of porn star, you know, or stripper or something like that, something to do with sex. There is still this sense that you are less respectable if you are more sexual as a woman. Now, obviously, that's going to curb people's behavior. Now, we have seen the numbers change. We have seen the numbers start to become more equal since the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And if you read things like A Court of Thorn and Roses, you see women be real randy. Like, women are horny. It isn't this thing that women are primarily love and they just, you know, put up with men wanting sex. And if you go into an encounter with a woman thinking they don't really like sex, they're just putting up with you, it's like whatever, you're going to be more likely to be one of those negative experiences than someone who does acknowledge the reality of female physical stimulation, physical pleasure, physical gratification. That's very real. And so you'll be better at sex if you acknowledge that women like sex just as much as men, and some women like sex more than some men. Let's give a nod to some of our, asexual, demisexual, gray sexual folks out there. They're valid too. And that's another reason why I don't think any particular thing, any particular amount of sexual experience should be seen as ideal. I do find it interesting in Japanese media that the number of partners a man has had, or this idea that they're out screwing women all over the place. We see that in The Witcher. We don't see that in Like a Dragon, right? Or Yakuza, for those of us here. It is depicted as very, very different. The number of sex partners a man has does not make him more of a man. In fact, him being more discerning about that is seen as a more positive masculine trait in at least the Japanese media I've consumed, and I've, consumed enough of it to think, well, I've gotten a decent sample size, and obviously there are some things that go against that, but, there's a lot of anime about a guy who's sort of an otaku. So he hasn't had any experience with an actual girl. And that's not, it's played for laughs, yes, but it's not seen as a shameful thing. And I mean, if you look at the sex and childbirth rates in Japan, we see a correlation, right? And I mean, if porn made people go out and have sex because it'd be, porn does this, it does something to somebody. Japan would have some of the highest sex rates in the world. It's got some of the lowest, because Japan has some next level smut out there. And I love how the appropriate word for that, for sexual content in women's stuff, is smut, not porn. It's porn. It's porn. But I'll say smut because that's the right word. YouTube probably won't censor it as much. But this is something we have to talk about, because if you go in thinking that you're at a deficit because you haven't had as much sexual experience, it's going to take a knock to your confidence. And it's not true. A lot of women, like I said, I gotta go, oh, thank God, less to unlearn, less mistakes to train you out of, people will, if a woman shames you because you weren't humping every hole you encountered, get away from that woman. Seriously. Women can be bad people too. But also I think we have to separate masculinity from the number of partners a man has had. It really does cheapen the soul of men, but it also heightens the fear in women of men. And, the gender critical feminists will go, good, we should be afraid of men. Men are terrifying. And I keep thinking about that thing the person said, I can either be weak or I can be a predator. I have to pick one. Great. That doesn't help anybody. So that's why I present the actual data on this stuff, so that people can actually be armed with, it's not great data, because these concepts of, oh, just men like sex and women don't, and things like that, or women aren't as interested in sex, they don't need as much sex, they're not as, all the crap. They're so ingrained, people don't bother to check very often. And quite frankly, whenever you get a conservative government, they don't want to know, so they won't fund the studies. But it's not true. And I think the more that people see that it's not true, the more men who aren't that promiscuous ideal, which I disagree with. I prefer the Japanese ideal. The Japanese ideal of masculinity is more appealing to me in a lot of different ways, but that's a topic for another time. First of all, men can feel less bad because, you know, when you don't live up to an ideal, you are aware of it, right? Even if you disagree with the ideal, you know you're going to be judged for not living up to that ideal. And so if we even the score a bit on the ideal, a lot more people are going to feel a lot better, and a lot fewer people are going to have to lie as much. Because the only way those numbers work is if somebody lying, right? Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK, or buy a one-time Leanna Cares session for someone who can use it but can't afford it, coffee.com/LeannaK. This stuff comes up a lot in Leanna Cares sessions. If you want to sign up for a Leanna Cares session, it's summer. It's a good time to do it because people take vacations and there's more availability. So thanks for watching. Manly Mondays.